Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our lecture 11 and lecture 12. If you recall, in the previous lectures, from lecture 7, lecture 8, lecture 9, and lecture 10, we covered the topic realism and anti-realism about economics. Now, if you recall, in that lecture, we looked at I gave you the introduction. I went through scientific realism, conventional philosophy of science. We went through ingredients of a minimal scientific realism. We also discussed common sensibles and their modifications in economic modeling. We also looked at the social construction of reality in economics, ladies and gentlemen. I remember during those lectures, I gave you a number of books that you are supposed to read. I hope you have had an opportunity to read those books. These included a book that is written by Austin, 1962, How to Do Things with Words. I also ask you to read the book, Adinot, 2008, which is The Invisible Hand in Economics, and that is published by Routledge. I asked you to read Boland, A Critique of Friedman's Critics, and also The Character and Logical Method of Political Economy. I asked you to read Caldwell, Friedman's Methodological Instrumentalism, and of course, David, 1991, Realism and Truth, ladies and gentlemen. Not forgetting those other important major texts like Machi, Scientific Realism and Some Peculiarities of Economics, and also Mackey, Scientific Realism and Ontology, and also Siros, Scientific Realism, How Science Tracks Truth. And that is really published by credible publishers. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's important that those very books that I gave you right from lecture 7 to lecture 10 are still relevant. I want you to continue reading them, and on that list, I want you to add Backhouse, 1997, Truth and the Progress in Economic Knowledge. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to read Backhouse, Explorations in Economic Methodology. I want you to read Blaug, The Methodology of Economics, How Economists Explain. And that is published by Cambridge University Press. Read also The Methodology of Economics, second edition, Cambridge. And The Methodology of Economic Model Building. And that is methodology after Samuelson, London, and published by Routledge, 1982. And to that list, please add Boland, 1992, The Principles of Economics, Some Lies My Teachers Told Me. And that is also published by Routledge. The list is quite long, ladies and gentlemen, but please read all those books. And I'm sure you'll be seeing a list of other books that seem to be very relevant. I hope I've not forgotten that book that I asked you to read, Karl Popper, Conjectures and Refutations, and that is published by Harper and Roll. So don't forget that. You also have The Logic of Scientific Discovery, London, and is published by Unwin, Heyman, and then Philosophy and the Mirror of Nature. Now, ladies and gentlemen, as I've already told you, today's lecture, which is lecture 10, lecture 11, which will be followed by lecture 12, will center around the topic that I have called The Rise and Fall of Popper and Lakatos in Economics, ladies and gentlemen. Now, in that topic that I've just given you, I want to tell you that the structure of our lecture will include looking at things like, one, the early engagements with Popper, and here I'm talking about economics, really getting to know about the importance of the works which were written by Karl Popper. And Karl Popper is one of those early philosophers, I'm sure you're aware. So we shall look at the early engagements with Popper, because economics as a discipline has had those engagements with Karl Popper. Again, we shall look at the engagements with Lakatos and the emergence of economic methodology, ladies and gentlemen. I know many times we do a lot of modeling, and especially in economics, and we don't even take time to understand how these things came into being and why we are using them and the interpretations and the limitations of those things. We shall continue with the movement from Popper and Lakatos, because certainly economists picked up these views with a lot of enthusiasm. But as time went on, certainly there was a loss of momentum and importance attached to Popper and Lakatos. Then I'll also take you through an appraisal of theories, so appraising economic theories, more specifically economic theories. And then we shall proceed to methodology after Lakatos. And then I'll take you to the conclusions, ladies and gentlemen. So in this lecture, I will try to be as brief as possible because I want you to go and read and pick these ideas. So I'm going to summarize most of the things. Now, if we start with the early engagements with Popper, ladies and gentlemen, we know that Popper's work on scientific method was barely noticed in economics until the time when he came up with this publication, Logique de Forschung, which was published in 1934. And that publication was actually translated as Logic of Scientific Discovery in 1959. So that's when it was published, and that's when most of the economists were able to get the book, read it, and try to understand the book, ladies and gentlemen. So we discover that a number of publications came up during that period, especially between the 1930s, 1940s, and the 1950s and the 1960s. In fact, in the 1930s, there was only one publication on falsification. And then in the 1940s, then again another one publication on historicism. And of course, in the 1950s, there were about 6 publications, actually 9 publications. 2 were on falsification, and 4 were on historicism, and about 3 on other aspects which were general in nature. And in the 1950s, 12 publications were on falsifications, and then 2 were on historicism, while others attracted around 4 publications, ladies and gentlemen. So as you can see, all those were important publications in the number of journals, especially what we call justo journal, and excluding specialist journals in separate fields like economic history, geography, and agriculture economics, ladies and gentlemen. But we also know that with the interdisciplinary journals, a number of publications had also started coming up in that area, and more so in the area of political science. And I know you are aware of that interaction and, of course, the confluence or intersection where you have political economics and then, of course, economics. So at the end of the day, you cannot talk about pure economics without discussing issues that relate to political economy. So again, as you can see, during the 1944 and the 1945, Popper's own publications were also there, but of course, among the publications I've just given you, we have left out those publications, but they were there certainly. Now, I want you to note here that in the 1940s, the only mention of Popper's work, and I'm talking about Karl Popper, was by Hayek, and the 1950s. Most references to his work were to his critique of historicism, only two being the ideas on scientific method that later became associated so firmly with his name. And of those, one, of course, the people who critiqued and, of course, also advanced his ideas, we find colleagues at the London School of Economics, and more so Kurt Klappers and Joseph Angus, and who published the works in the Journal of Economica. And they stated categorically that their work was based on the works of Karl Popper, as you can see. And that is after the Logic of Scientific Discovery was published in English, certainly. And this changed the entire landscape of knowledge creation in the discipline of economics. And many new ideas came up, and many people started espousing the perspectives and the ideas that Karl Popper had, certainly, brought to the fore. So that's when we see economics trying to really embrace the works of Karl Popper and trying to follow his methodology. Now, we also see that the first citation was by Kenneth Arrow, who bracketed his idea with those of Milton Friedman when he wrote, this is exactly what he said, sharpness of the implications of a hypothesis are a virtue, not a vice, provided, of course, the implications are not refuted by evidence. So when Kenneth Arrow tried to bracket the ideas of Karl Popper and the ideas of Milton Friedman, and more so, what I'm giving you here are the ideas that come from Milton Friedman. You know Milton Friedman very well because he's one of the celebrated economists of our time. He has contributed a lot to the discipline of economics. So, but Kenneth Arrow bracketed those ideas, and he simply said that sharpness of the implications of a hypothesis are a virtue and not a vice. But he inserts a caveat there, and he says, provided, of course, the implications are not refuted by evidence. And that was Arrow 1960, and what he wrote, you'll find that on page 177. So we see that Kenneth Arrow, one of the economists, picking up the ideas of Friedman and trying to interrogate those specific ideas to see how they inform the growth of the discipline. Now, it is also quite interesting at this material time, ladies and gentlemen, to note that the equation of Friedman and Popper contrasted with one of the two assessments published in the 1950s, and you'll find that in the works of Day in 1955, and on page 67. And those people had used Popper's work to criticize Friedman's views of scientific inference. So, but anyway, the idea I'm trying to put across, ladies and gentlemen, as I said, I will not really go into details of this thing. You will go and read the history about this kind of thing. But I just want you to know that economics has had that interaction with the philosophy of science. And it picked a lot from the works of Karl Popper. And that's why I've asked you to read the work, the book, Conjectures and Refutations by Karl Popper, so that you see how the views and the ideas of Karl Popper influenced economists in the 1940s, in the 1950s, in the 1930s, and the 1970s, by the way, up to where we are today. The debate is still on and it's unresolved, and some people have actually dismissed some of those ideas. And these are economists who believe that, economics is a subject that is very close to natural sciences, actually very close to biology and what they call physics. And that's why in some of the conferences that were held, it was actually joint, these were joint conferences where you had specialists in economics, specialists in biology, and specialists in physics coming together to contribute ideas in this perspective. So as you can see, in 1961, Chris Archibald also used Popper to criticize Friedman, and he attempted to interpret Friedman as a verificationist who believed that theories could be verified on the basis of successful predictions, even if some predictions, ladies and gentlemen, were not very, very, very successful. So we can see here, as economists cited Popper with greater frequency, they cited his emphasis on critical procedures in most cases. They also cited predictions as a test of a theory, of course rejecting criticiability, not truth, falsity as the relevant demarcation criterion. So they emphasize those things, carving critical procedures in the growing understanding of the discipline of economics. So even predictions as a test of a theory. So economists of that time believed that if you want to know whether theory is robust enough or very strong, then let's look at predictions, right? If we are able to predict a number of things using a particular theory, then we are able to achieve results. And these are ideas that were picked from Karl Popper. And of course, also the divide between rejection, criticizability, not really based on what we call truth or falsity. So they rejected the idea of trying to look at truth and falsity or falsifying those particular concepts. So for them, it was an issue of rejection and trying to criticize those particular aspects. So the notion of critical content and the contrast between empirical and mathematical sciences then came to the fore, and there was a general growth of knowledge in this area. And by the late 1960s, it was being claimed that Popper's views had become dominant, ladies and gentlemen. In fact, many economists were using views of Karl Popper, and this was largely because of the influential work by Karl Popper in 1934 and 1959 that were widely used by economists, ladies and gentlemen. So this remark was quite interesting during that time, because the most prominent methodological debate of the preceding 2 decades that one might expect to have been crucial in determining the dominant methodological thinking, and these were certainly based on the works of Karl Popper. But again, in 1953, we know very well that Friedman was around, and there was an influential work by Friedman, and that was called The Methodology of Positive Economics, ladies and gentlemen, in 1953. And his emphasis on testing hypotheses on the basis of their predictions had, as had been explained, been seen as Popperian. In fact, most people thought that the ideas that Milton Friedman was actually advancing were not his own ideas. These were ideas of Karl Popper. But of course, they had had an interaction, or they had met at a conference, in one of the conferences. But Friedman, Milton believes that he didn't really pick a lot from his work. So his works came from the experience. But anyway, you need to know that Friedman met Popper at the Mont Pelerin Society, but the links between the ideas are uncertain. So it would be a little bit problematic for us to claim that actually Friedman Milton picked the views of Karl Popper. He also had his own ideas. So given the importance of the issue that we are discussing, it is worth, ladies and gentlemen, for us to understand exactly what exists in literature out there. And that's why I want you to go and read. I mean, there's no shortcut to this. So let me just quote for you an interview that Friedman gave to Daniel Hammond. And he was actually talking about his interaction with Karl Popper when they when they met. So in that interview, which was given in 1988 to Daniel Hammond, and you'll find that in his work in 1993, page 223, and this is what Friedman says. So Daniel Hammond asked Friedman a question that, did you read any philosophy when you were a graduate student? And Milton Friedman said, none that I recall. Certainly about the only methodology philosophy I have read is Popper. So Milton Friedman read the works of Popper, and he says, I have read his conjectures and refutations, as well as the open society and its enemies. So that's what Friedman says, and he says, I think those are two main things or Poppers that I've read. Then Daniel Hammond went ahead and asked a second question. He says, I noticed that in the new paragraph 1987, Alan Walters says that in your 1953 methodology essay, you introduced Popper's philosophy of science to economics. Would that be an overstatement then? Milton Friedman said, no, my introduction to Popper did not come from writings. I met him in person in 1947 at the first meeting of the Mont Pelerin Society. I was very much impressed with him, with the ideas, and I spent a long time talking to him there. I did not read, and he says, I did not read his Logique de Fonchang, but I knew the basic ideas from my contact with him, and I have no doubt that that particular contact with him did have a good deal of influence on me. And that's what Milton Friedman admits himself. And then he goes ahead and says, well, that's all that I know about my interaction with Popper, but not because I am actually influenced and that I'm promoting the ideas of Karl Popper. So, ladies and gentlemen, as you know very well, at this time we are simply saying that despite the arguments we are advancing at this material time, there is strong evidence that Friedman's argument stemmed as much from ideas he had worked out as a practicing economist. You know, Friedman was a practicing economist before he met Popper. And therefore, he had experienced the reality of economics out there. And of course, we can't deny the fact that he did not pick ideas here and there from Karl Popper. Yes, he did pick. He also admits that he read Karl Popper's book, especially when it was translated later on in English. So, as you can see, that is very important. So, the result was that even if this man we are talking about, Milton Friedman, was influenced by discussions with the Poppers, his methodology was distinctive. It was distinctive to the extent that it is misleading to see it as simply Popperian. But that doesn't mean that the ideas from Karl Popper are useless. No, that's not what you're saying. So in the 1950s and the 1960s, it was actually Friedman whose work on methodology had the greatest influence, Popper being cited far less frequently. Although earlier on, economists were actually citing Karl Popper in the 1930s, in the 1940s, and possibly in the early 1950s. But later on, in the 50s and 60s, it was the works of Friedman that were really being cited quite often. So to place the citations in what I have just given, the summary that I gave you, and for us to put into perspective, right, we need to understand that the combination that you call Friedman's plus positive economics occurs in about 157 articles between 1952 and 1969, excluding articles by Friedman, ladies and gentlemen. So you can see that we have evidence that Popperian ideas actually in one way or the other have influenced the area of economics, but do not forget that Milton Friedman also had his own views, and that is very important. So it was Friedman whose ideas represented one side in the debate, over what we call marginalist theories of the farm. So there was a debate over the role of assumptions in economic theory, which were centered on Friedman. And if you recall, in the previous 4 lectures, right from lecture 7 to lecture 10, we did discuss those issues of realism and anti-realism in economics. So you see that one of the things that scholars have advanced to dismiss the ideas of early scholars are the issues that relate to the assumptions. And that's why last time I told you that some scholars think that that farm that is being talked about in literature, the farm that is being advanced by economists, right, when they begin actually listing down assumptions that are unrealistic, that farm is fictitious, and that's what they said, and therefore you cannot bet your results on that. So all those debates and disputes that you find in literature, and that's why I want you to read. So there was a debate over the role of assumptions in economic theory, which was centered on Friedman, ladies and gentlemen. So in the course of this, I hope you are very familiar with Paul Samuelson, also an economist, arguably one of the leading economists, what you call economic theorists of the time, argued that assumptions should be realistic, a claim that was actually denounced by Fritz Matschlapp. So I did give you the ideas of Matschlapp in the previous 4 lectures. So Samuelson argued and said, well, if you're talking about assumptions, assumptions should be realistic, right? And of course, Fritz Matschlapp said, no, that is not correct. So the dominant framework taken from a philosopher of science, if there was one, ladies and gentlemen, was logical empiricism at that time. So Nagel in 1963, and you know this gentleman called Nagel, if you look at his works, Nagel, a leading logical empirist, entered the debate over the realism of assumptions. And he was concerned with realism. How realistic, how can we say that these assumptions we are making do capture the reality out there? So he introduced, actually, he entered the debate, and these were related to realism of assumptions, right? So Matschlapp 1964, as we see, drew on such ideas in arguing against Samuelson, again, as you can see. So, however, it is wrong, ladies and gentlemen, to claim that there was a single dominant view around that time, although the range of approaches to methodology underlying the pragmatic packages of styles of economics that came to dominate the literature, ladies and gentlemen. So that's why one influential approach was articulated in the Tarling-Koopman's 3 essays on the state of economic science in 1957. And he proposed that economic theories formed a sequence, each unrealistic, but the prelude to more realistic theories. So that is the thinking. Now, as I wind up this section, this particular part, because time is going, we see that later on there was a meeting, actually a conference, that, not a conference, there was a commission that came up to discuss some of the things that, and the ideas and the views and the knowledge that had been created in the area of economics. So we see that the Cause Commission that was introduced during that time, which was very, very central to the emergence of modern econometrics. So when you talk about econometrics, you may not know where this concept of econometrics came from, but I want to tell you it comes from the Cause Commission, and was very, very central in promoting and pushing for this econometrics. And of course, it implied integrating rigorous mathematical theory with a formal statistical modeling to test such theories against data. So, of course, later on, from the Chicago, though from the economics department rather, than the Cause Commission was Friedman's claim that theories should be tested according to their ability successfully to predict phenomena that they were designed to explain. And that was actually Friedman. And this actually came from the Chicago school, from the economics departments, ladies and gentlemen. So Friedman spanned both the formal economic theory and econometric models of the Cowes Commission, and that third strand was Samuel's operationalism drawing on passive Brigman. So the logical empiricism brought into this logical empiricism, ladies and gentlemen, brought into the debate by such as individuals like Nagel and Matchlap was a fourth strand and quite important. So at the same time, there were also many other works that were going on at the London School of Economics, ladies and gentlemen. So I'll ask you to go and read works, more so on basic postulates of economic theory, for you to gain more knowledge and understanding of what happened. So I can only say, ladies and gentlemen, that in the early 1960s, Archibald entered into a dispute with the Friedman and Chicago over the theory of the firm. So he started from the premise that in the last few years, we have had something of a revolution in methodology, and the economists who have advocated the new methodology have found that it gives them a powerful position from which to criticize Professor Chamberlain's theory of monopolistic competition. I'm sure you are very aware of that theory of monopolistic competition. So there was a dispute then. Now, in the course of criticizing Chamberlain, he also offered a critique of Chicago that was taken up by Stigler in 1963 and Friedman in 1963. And they cite Clapples and Argus in support of their works. So what Archibald was doing was really offering a methodological critique that was clearly inspired by Poppelian methodology, ladies and gentlemen. So allow me at this material time to bring in another thinking that cropped up at that time, and this is really another product of this kind of debate, and this is what we call the methodology, measurement, and testing group, right? And that was spearheaded, and of course people who were behind it include Lipsey. I'm sure for some of you who studied during our times and our days, you studied that book we call Positive Economics by Lipsey, if you recall. And that was Lipsey's introduction to positive economics in 1963. Now, though an introductory textbook, it was a manifesto for Poppelian methodology, ladies and gentlemen. So that is what it is. You needed to know the Me Too concept, the me squared concept, right? And the me squared is what we call methodology, measurement, and testing. So wherever you find it, please get to know that's what it is. But it came from the London School of Economics staff seminar in methodology, measurement, and testing, and was centered around Richard Lipsey and Chris Archibald, trying to promote the concepts of positive economics, ladies and gentlemen. So all those have been very important. Now, allow me at this material time to proceed to our next topic, heading actually, subheading within this important topic or subject. And that is Lakatos and the emergence of economic methodology. So what really happened? Now, I've just given you a story of what has been happening in terms of knowledge creation and theory building, and the development of methodologies in the area of economics. So I want you to appreciate the fact that there was a spate of methodological discussions within economics during the 1960s in which Poppelian themes were never far from the surface. So these things continued surfacing, coming up from time to time. So mathematical economic theory and econometric, those are statistical methods, had advanced greatly since the Second World War, but without the dramatic successes that their earlier supporters had hoped for. So they had hopes, and they had those particular ambitions on what this should achieve, but it was not possible to achieve that. So the question of how theory and the evidence related were very topical. So people are talking about theory and they're talking about evidence, right? So if you go out and test, right, the results that you get from the field, they inform theory development or revisions in the theory. Now, you know very well that economists were, during that time, were really not very much willing to undo their theories. Well, you can critique, but they will continue using those theories anyway. So you find that in terms of development of theories, economists have been a little bit rigid, ladies and gentlemen. So as information technology and data collection improved, these questions became more urgent, the issue of theory and the issue of evidence. So it was against this background, ladies and gentlemen, that Popperian methodology was augmented with those of Imre Lakatos. So remember, we're talking about the Popperian and Lakatosian thinking or ideas or philosophies. So now, when you look at the works of Imre Lakatos, his falsification and the methodology of scientific research programs was first published in a volume referred to as Criticism and the Growth of Knowledge in 1970s. That work focused on comparing the ideas of Popper with those of Thomas Kuhn. That's another book I've asked you to read, Kuhn, and that is really the scientific, art of scientific revolution. So you need to really read that work of Thomas Kuhn. So to understand the way economists responded, it is necessary, ladies and gentlemen, today to go back to consider something of the early reception of Kuhn's ideas in economics, because Kuhn also contributed to the growth of the discipline, the theorizing of the discipline, what we call the philosophies in economics. So the first person to bring Kuhn's ideas into economics was Bob Coates. Bob Coates, you know, this is an influential economists who came up with ideas in 1969. And Bob Coates asked fundamental questions, and he said, is there a structure of scientific revolutions in economics? He went ahead and asked a question that as we try to answer this particular question, right? And in asking this question, right, he wanted to see how knowledge in economics had actually grown and how it had incorporated the ideas of Kuhn, that is Thomas Kuhn. And here we're talking about the scientific revolution, the structure of scientific revolution. So is it there in economics, right? So, and of course, he was also trying to understand the interpretations that economists were drawing from the empirical works that applied the structure of scientific revolution. Thomas Kuhn, certainly referred to as the Kuhnian kind of thinking or scientific revolution. So we see that that ground certainly was or had been prepared by a major figure in the history of economics or economic ideas, and that is the economist Joseph Schumpeter. You're very familiar with the works of Joseph Schumpeter, who had been at Harvard in the 1940s. And Schumpeter had actually interacted with the Kuhn, Thomas Kuhn, so they knew each other. Kuhn was actually a colleague of Schumpeter at Harvard, during the 1940s. So Schumpeter's analysis of the progress of economic thought was based on the notion that science was a professional activity, and these practitioners were actually sharing, or had to share, sets of standards and values, right? So that's what it is, and that's the thinking of Schumpeter. So, ladies and gentlemen, in economics, therefore, when we start talking about the philosophy of economics, remember Karl Popper has been very influential. Remember Kuhn, Thomas Kuhn has been very influential. Then Lakatos has been very very, very influential as well. So in economics, therefore, when Lakatosian ideas emerged as a Popperian response to Kuhn, they were rapidly taken up by historians of the subject. And that's why in 1974, there took place what you may call the Naples Colloquium on Research Programs in Physics and economics, out of which 2 volumes emerged, one on physics and the other one in economics. So this was a combined colloquium, which certainly discussed issues from both perspectives. And of course, the idea was that physics and biology and economics are somehow related, and that the latter method and appraisal in economics, which was certainly published in 1976, was also very influential in this case, and took on the ideas of Lakatos, ladies and gentlemen. So very, very important for us to know these aspects that came up during that material time. So during that time, there was a very strong historical dimension to the volume of works and research and publications that came up. And no wonder the case studies that were developed during that time were inevitably historical in nature, because they took on the perspectives of Lakatos. Lakatos believed very much in historical data. So Lakatosian method simply states that to compare rational reconstructions written as though science progressed in accordance with his methodology with the actual history. So the element of history had to be brought to the fore, that you have to think about that aspect. And that's why many volumes were published, volumes of work, books and so forth, and journal publications published by many, many economists with the reputation in the history of economic thought. And you'll find that in the works of Coates and Hutchison and a number of other scholars, ladies and gentlemen. So you can also add on the list a scholar called Axel Legenwood, Herbert Simon is another fellow, and John Hicks. And all these certainly came up, and they are very influential, ladies and gentlemen. So don't forget Friedman, Samuelson, Archibald, and others, Kuhn, and so forth, Coates. And unfortunately, I will not really go very much into those perspectives, because I believe you'll be able to go and read, ladies and gentlemen. But do not forget to read the textbook on economic methodology, Ian Stewart's Reasoning and Methods in Economics, 1979. Because it really has so many things that are important. It has chapters on deduction, induction, hypothetical deductive methods, which were followed by other ones on distinctive features of economic data, economic theory and reality, applied economics and statistical methods, ladies and gentlemen. And of course, it will be quite important for us to appreciate what these fellows have brought in terms of methodology in the area of economics. So that's why the works of those fellows, which you'll find the logical structure of economic theories, which was very interesting, was followed by a chapter from Popper to the new heterodoxy, and that's the new heterodoxy over Kuhn, Lakatos, and Feyerabend's methodological anarchism. So those ones, of course, give sufficient information for us to advance the debate in the area of economics, especially the philosophy of economics. So one of the major issues that even remain up to today is that particular challenge, that particular problem, is to how to persuade economics, or economists in this case. How can we persuade economists to somehow take on ideas, views and perspectives that have come from Karl Popper, Kuhn, with the structure of scientific revolution, to try and improve our understanding and inform our thinking in the area of economics, ladies and gentlemen. So it's very, very important. So again, you can look at the works of Marshall. You're very familiar with Marshall, Marshallian economics, which also collapsed at a certain stage. So this is quite important for us to pick, ladies and gentlemen. So allow me right now to move very, very, very fast and take you to the movement from Popper and Lakatos. And again, I'm going to summarize that, and then the rest we shall discuss in our next lecture, which is lecture 12. So how about this movement from Popper and Lakatos? I want to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that in the mid-1980s, those mid-1980s, I'm sure many of you that I'm talking to were around during that time. So in the mid-1980s, the 1980s were actually marked with a high point of interest in Lakatosian methodology. So scholars in the area of economics picked interest in Lakatos. So they wanted to know what was happening. So that's why you find the works of Winthrop's Appraising Economic Theories, which was published in 1985, being symbolic of this. And when you read the works of Winthrop, Appraising Economic Theories, you'll find that it is based mainly on Lakatosian theory, Lakatosian thinking, Lakatosian philosophy of science. So as you can see here, some of those writings on economic methodology continued, fortunately or unfortunately for some of you who do not want to hear, Karl Popper. So the ideas of Karl Popper also cropped up in this very work that we are talking about. So whereas Winthrop somehow drew a lot from the works of Popper, from the works of Lakatos, but he was able to pick ideas from the works of Popper. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's what it is. And of course, many other works came up in terms of falsifications, right, of the various concepts of various ideas. So, Boland interpreted Popper. Boland published his works in 1982, and somehow he also critiqued the works of Jonas Klant, 1984. But you'll discover that Boland interpreted Popper not as prescribing a particular methodology in terms of falsification, but as deriving methods that were dependent on the problems to which they were to be applied. And that was his thinking. So his book, therefore, focused on specific problems of economics and economic model building. So those specific issues came up, and that's why I say in Klant, 1984, ladies and gentlemen, in contrast, offered a wide-ranging account of the philosophy of science. And these wide-ranging aspects drew far more than what was known as conventional philosophy of science, and therefore he introduced these ideas in the area of economics. So, however, his conclusions, which are reflected in his title, The Rules of the Game, and that's the logical structure of economic theories, was a set of rules that should govern economic research. And these are contained in many writings, which you will find, but most importantly, these works also contained many observations which were specific to economic theories, ladies and gentlemen. So that's what it is, and my objective was to actually move you very fast and bring you to that level. So the works of Winthrop, do not forget to read or search and read what his ideas are. And these proved to be very important in trying to probe and discover how theory and evidence interacted in a specific context, ladies and gentlemen. So while other people came up with a critical approach and a critical stance towards the entire Popper Lakatos program, these people were trying to see how they can actually promote these kind of ideas. So don't forget, there was a movement that came up. And again, at that conference that I gave you, or a colloquium, which was the Naphtalion colloquium, right? During that conference, they discussed issues relating to lactose, and but more specifically dealing with lactose's methodology of scientific research program, which is abbreviated as MSRP. And of course, in that conference, there was wide hostility from economists because they thought that the organizers of this colloquium wanted to promote the lactosian thinking. So that's why there was that animosity, there was that hostility, and that is very important. So as you can see, the methodology of scientific research program proposed by Lakatos was in the line of the proposals which were made by Popper. And then, of course, Daniel Hosman, a philosopher, opened in the meeting, that particular conference or colloquium, by arguing that Popper's philosophy of science was a mess, right? And that's what he said in his opening remarks. Popper's philosophy of science was a mess, confusing logical falsifiability with falsifiability as a methodology. So that is falsifying. So how falsifiability of methodology and falsifying logic that comes as a result of that. So that is what he said, and that was really the thinking of Hosman, Daniel Hosman. So he was a little bit, and he wasn't very much interested in hearing these works that, or the idea that came from Popper. So to him, Popper's ideas were just a mess, full of confusion and a set of norms that should govern, probably shouldn't govern scientific inquiry. So as you can see, that's what it is, ladies and gentlemen. So read the works of Dimash, who also responds to the works of Daniel, and then plus other people who have contributed to the debate. But more so, please read the works of Winthrop, 1989, who says that methodology does not matter, really. So all those are very important, ladies and gentlemen. So I believe that you'll be able to read and get to understand those aspects, ladies and gentlemen. Right now, allow me, ladies and gentlemen, to remind you a few things. If you recall, at the beginning of this lecture, I told you that there are a number of things that we need to pick for our lecture. And those are the things that we have actually discussed. The ideas, the structure of our presentation has been early engagements with Popper. We have also discussed the lactose and the emergence of economic methodology. We have also had an opportunity to discuss the movement from Popper and lactose, ladies and gentlemen. Now, two things that we have not discussed, which will be discussed in lecture 12, relates to appraising economic theories and methodology after lactose. So what happens? So how does now methodology develop after the Lactosian philosophy of science and Karl Popper's philosophy of science, ladies and gentlemen? So don't forget to get those books that I have asked you to read. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you very much for attending this lecture 11. It has been a pleasure and continues to be a pleasure meeting you and discussing these issues. I can only say stay home and stay safe. So let's meet this week again to try and discuss lecture 12 that will center around the same ideas, but more so focusing on appraising economic theories and the methodology after lactose. Thank you very much. Bye.